She saved his life with her bare hands, and they tried to fire her for it. The blood hadn't even dried on the ER floor when Dr. Victor Langley pointed at Emma Whitaker and said the words that would become the biggest mistake of his career. "Get her out of my hospital." She was 29 years old, she was a nurse, and she had just done something no one in that room had ever seen. Stopped a fatal hemorrhage using a technique that shouldn't exist outside a combat zone. What Langley didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Emma Whitaker had bled for this country in places that don't appear on any map. And the man she just saved, he was carrying proof that would bring the entire hospital down. If this story already has you on the edge of your seat, stay with me until the very end. Like this video, drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Let's go. No. The call came in at 11:47 p.m. Not that Emma was watching the clock. She rarely did anymore. Shift work had a way of dissolving time into something shapeless, one fluorescent hour bleeding into the next. She was restocking a supply cart at the far end of the hallway when the radio on the wall crackled and the dispatcher's voice cut through the quiet of Redwood Valley Medical Center's overnight floor like a blade. Incoming trauma, ETA 4 minutes. Male, mid-40s. GSW to the left flank. Suspected arterial involvement. BP dropping. He's coding in the rig. Emma's hand stopped moving. Arterial. That word always landed different than the others. She pushed the cart against the wall and moved toward the trauma bay. Not running. She'd learned a long time ago that running before you know the situation just burns energy you can't afford. But moving with the kind of steady, unhurried speed that looks calm until you realize how fast the ground is passing under your feet. The ER at Redwood Valley wasn't a large operation. Ashford, Colorado sat at the base of the Rockies with a population just under 40,000, and the medical center served a wide radius of mountain towns that didn't have much else. Most nights, the trauma bay was quiet. A broken arm from a ski slope. A bad reaction to altitude. The occasional bar fight that got out of hand. Tonight was not most nights. Emma pushed through the double doors into the bay and found it already half-populated with staff. 2 residents standing near the equipment wall, a charge nurse named Della running through the crash cart inventory, and Dr. Victor Langley standing at the center of the room with his arms folded like he was waiting for a reservation to be confirmed rather than a dying man to arrive. Langley was 53, silver-haired, and possessed of the specific kind of authority that came from never having been seriously wrong, or at least never having been caught. He was the chief of surgery at Redwood Valley, which in a town like Ashford meant he was roughly equivalent to a small god. He signed the schedules. He controlled the OR. He decided who got credit and who got nothing. And over the 11 months Emma had worked here, she had watched him make those decisions with the casual precision of someone who had long since stopped pretending the process was fair. He glanced at her when she walked in. "Whitaker." He said her name the way some people say, and as though her presence required justification. "What's your assignment tonight?" "Overnight floor, Bay 3. She moved to the supply station and started pulling gloves. "But if you're short..." "We're not short." He turned back toward the bay doors. "Stay available for your own patients." Emma pulled the gloves on anyway. She heard the ambulance before she saw it. The shriek of brakes, the rolling clatter of wheels on concrete, and then the doors burst open and the paramedics came through fast, one of them holding a pressure pack against the patient's left side, while the other called out numbers in that rapid-fire shorthand that always sounded, to civilians, like a different language. "John Doe, approximately 45, GSW, left flank, exit wound compromised, BP 74 over 40 and falling. We've got him on 2 large-bore IVs, but he's been bleeding through." Emma saw the wound before anyone else moved. Not the obvious part, the gauze soaked through, the dark stain spreading beneath the paramedic's hands. She saw the angle of it, the placement, the way the patient's left shoulder was dropping slightly lower than the right, the almost imperceptible asymmetry in his chest rise that told her the bleed wasn't confined to where everyone was looking. "His respirations are uneven," she said. It came out flat and factual, not a question. One of the residents, young guy, Harmon, 2 months out of medical school and already exhausted, glanced at her. "What?" "Left side chest rise is compromised. The bleed may have tracked up." She moved closer, eyes on the patient's face, gray, slack, the look of someone whose body had already begun the quiet negotiation with shutdown. Has anyone assessed for hemothorax? Nobody asked for your assessment. Langley's voice landed between her shoulder blades like a hand. She turned. He was looking at her with the particular expression she'd catalogued over the past 11 months. Not anger exactly, more like the mild irritation of someone swatting a fly that keeps returning to the same spot. Back off, nurse. Let the professionals handle it. The word nurse did what it was designed to do. It drew a line, put her on one side of it and everyone else on the other. Emma held his gaze for exactly 1 second. Then she stepped back. Not because she agreed, because she knew this particular battlefield well enough to know that a direct confrontation with Langley in front of his staff, while a patient was actively dying, would cost her the ability to do anything useful at all. She watched. Langley moved to the table with the smooth efficiency of someone performing a routine he'd run hundreds of times. He called for ultrasound. He ordered labs. He talked through his assessment with the confidence of a man who hadn't seriously questioned his own judgment in years. He was not incompetent. That was the thing people never understood about men like Langley. The really dangerous ones weren't incompetent. They were capable enough to believe their own certainty and certain enough to ignore what didn't fit. He missed the hemothorax. Emma saw it happen, saw the moment he looked at the ultrasound image and his eyes moved past the fluid collection in the chest cavity without registering it, his attention already on the abdominal bleed that was the more obvious problem. She saw Della, the charge nurse, open her mouth and then close it again. Saw Harmon look at the screen and then look at Langley and decide in the space of a breath that this was not his hill. I think there's fluid in the left chest, Emma said. She kept her voice level, clinical, the tone of someone offering information, not picking a fight. Langley turned slowly. I told you to back off. The ultrasound is being read by people with medical degrees. He took one deliberate step toward her. One more word, and I will have you escorted out of this bay and written up for interference with active patient care. Are we clear? The room was completely silent. Della had stopped moving. The residents were looking at the floor. Emma said nothing. The patient's monitor screamed. Not the steady beeping of someone in distress, the flat, continuous tone of systolic collapse. The number on the screen read 48 over something, and then 41. And then the bottom dropped out entirely, and the readout went into the ugly, fragmented pattern that meant the heart was doing its best, but the blood pressure to support it simply wasn't there. He's crashing, Harmon said, his voice climbing. BP's tanking, he's... Push fluids, get me the OR on the line. There's no time for the OR. Emma was already at the table. She wasn't thinking about Langley anymore. She wasn't thinking about her job, or the write-up, or the 11 months of careful navigation she was about to burn to the ground. She was thinking about the angle of the bleed and the position of the exit wound and a training room in Fort Bliss, Texas, 7 years ago, where a quiet-spoken instructor named Sergeant Kwan had walked her through hemorrhage control techniques that the civilian medical world wouldn't catch up to for another decade. What do you think He's gonna die in the next 90 seconds if I don't do this. She didn't look at Langley. Her hands were already moving, gloved, positioned, applying direct bimanual compression to the chest wall in the precise location the ultrasound had shown her. Not a technique you'd find in any civilian trauma protocol, not something they taught at nursing school. Someone needs to be ready with a thoracostomy tray, left side. Don't you dare. Call it, she said to Harmon. Not a request. Harmon hesitated for exactly 2 seconds, then, get me the thoracostomy tray. Left side, let's go. What happened in the next 4 minutes was not smooth. It was not elegant. Emma's arms burned. The patient's chest was doing something complicated and wrong beneath her hands, and she had to adjust twice. Once when the compression angle shifted. Once when his body responded to a fluid bolus in a way that required her to recalibrate the pressure. She talked herself through it under her breath, not instructions for the staff, just the internal narration that had carried her through worse situations than this in places she had promised herself she would stop thinking about. The bleeding slowed. Not stopped, slowed. Which was the most she could ask for because the goal wasn't to fix him. The goal was to keep him from dying in the next 90 seconds until someone with a scalpel could do the actual repair. "BP's coming up," Della said quietly. She was watching the monitor with the expression of someone who had seen a lot of things and was now seeing something she didn't have a category for. 82/50. Emma kept the pressure. "He needs the OR. Hemothorax confirmed, probable aortic branch involvement from the trajectory of the wound. Whoever scrubs in needs to know the bleed is proximal, not distal. They'll be looking in the wrong place otherwise." Nobody moved for a moment. Then Langley said very quietly, "Get the OR team on the phone." He did not look at Emma. Emma held compression until the OR team arrived and the patient was transferred. And the moment her hands came free, she stepped back from the table and stripped her gloves and stood against the wall while the controlled chaos of surgical prep swirled around her. Her arms were shaking. She noticed this the way you notice weather. As a fact, not a complaint. The patient was still alive. That was the thing she was holding on to when Langley walked up to her. He stood close. That was deliberate. She recognized the technique, the way men with power used physical proximity as a substitute for an argument they couldn't actually make. "You violated protocol," he said. "You performed an unauthorized procedure on a patient without physician direction. You created significant liability for this hospital and for yourself." He paused. "I'm recommending your suspension pending a full review." Emma looked at him. She was tired. Her arms were shaking. She had just spent 4 minutes keeping a man alive with her hands, and the man in front of her was talking about protocol. "Okay," she said. It wasn't agreement. It wasn't surrender. It was just the only word she could find that wouldn't make things worse, and Langley seemed to interpret it as capitulation because something shifted in his expression, not quite satisfaction, but the relief of a conclusion. "Security will escort you to collect your things." He walked away. Emma watched him go. She became aware gradually of the fact that the other staff were watching her, not openly, not the way people watch a confrontation, but in the peripheral way, glances held a half-second too long, attention that was pretending to be elsewhere. Harmon caught her eye from across the room and gave her a look that was half apology and half something she couldn't name. She looked away. She was thinking about the patient. Specifically, she was thinking about what she'd noticed when they first brought him in, something she hadn't mentioned to Langley because there hadn't been a moment where mentioning it wouldn't have just become another thing for him to dismiss. When the paramedics transferred the patient from the gurney to the table, his jacket had come open. Just for a second, just long enough for Emma, who was standing at the right angle, to see what was attached to the inner lining. Not a wallet, not a phone. A military identification tag. The kind you didn't see outside of active service, classified units, or the very specific bureaucratic machinery of the intelligence community. She'd seen that format exactly once before, in a briefing room at a base that didn't technically exist, and the sight of it had produced a sensation she didn't have a clean word for, something between recognition and alarm. She was still thinking about it when the sound reached her. Not sirens, something lower, deeper. The mechanical percussion of multiple vehicles arriving simultaneously in the parking structure adjacent to the ER entrance, and then, she wasn't imagining it, the distinctive, disciplined rhythm of boots on concrete, moving fast, moving in formation. Della appeared at Emma's elbow, her voice dropped to something barely above a breath. "There are vehicles outside," she said. "Black, military plates, a lot of them." Emma turned toward the ER doors. Through the reinforced glass panels, she could see the parking lot. 3 dark SUVs positioned in a containment pattern. She knew what a containment pattern looked like. She'd helped set one up once, in a country she was not supposed to have been in. The vehicle's doors were open. Men were moving toward the hospital entrance with the specific efficiency of people who had been briefed, who had rehearsed, who knew exactly where they were going. "Someone call administration," the desk clerk said, her voice unsteady. "Someone needs to..." The doors opened. They came through in pairs, not running but covering ground fast, in dark tactical gear without insignia. No branch markings, no unit patches, nothing that would tell you which part of the government had sent them. The lead figure was a tall man, maybe early 50s, with the kind of bearing that came from 20 years of making decisions under conditions where being wrong meant people died. He didn't pause at the desk. He didn't ask for directions. His eyes moved across the room with practiced efficiency. They stopped on Emma. He crossed the distance between them in 12 steps. Emma counted, because counting was something to do when every other part of her brain was running calculations she didn't want to examine too closely. He stopped in front of her, close, but not Langley close. This was the proximity of someone treating her as an equal, not trying to intimidate her. His eyes were the flat, assessing gray of someone who had learned to read people the way other people read maps. "You're Emma Whitaker?" Her mouth was dry. "Yes?" He held her gaze for a long moment. The ER had gone completely silent around them. Staff, security, the desk clerk, all of them watching with the still, uncertain attention of people who have suddenly realized they are in a situation they don't have the context to understand. The man's expression didn't change, but something shifted in it, a fractional softening, or maybe just the release of a tension that had been held for a long time. "We've been looking for you," he said, and the whole room held its breath. Nobody moved. That was the thing Emma noticed first. Not the gear, not the weapons holstered at every hip, not the way the two operators flanking the commander had positioned themselves with the unconscious precision of people who do this for a living. What she noticed was the stillness. The entire ER had turned into a photograph of itself. Della frozen mid-step near the crash cart. Harmon with his hands at his sides like he'd forgotten what they were for. The desk clerk with her phone halfway to her ear, the call she'd been trying to make suspended in some bureaucratic limbo she no longer had the nerve to complete. They were all watching Emma, which meant they were all realizing in real time that they had spent the last hour treating a person they did not actually know. The commander, she still didn't have a name for him, and he hadn't offered one, held her gaze with the patience of someone who understood that silence was a tool and knew how to use it without wasting it. Emma had met men like him before. Not many. The kind of stillness he carried wasn't something you practiced in a gym or learned from a book. It was the residue of a particular kind of experience, compressed and settled until it became part of how a person occupied space. "We should talk somewhere private," he said. It wasn't a question. It wasn't exactly an order. It was the phrasing of someone who had learned to phrase things in ways that people agreed to without realizing they'd been asked. Emma glanced around the room. Langley had reappeared at the edge of the bay, standing near the corridor entrance with his arms crossed, and his face arranged into something that was trying to be professional authority and landing somewhere closer to controlled alarm. He was watching the commander the way a man watches a storm he can't outrun, with the calculation of someone running options and finding most of them closed. "There's a consultation room," Emma said, "down the hall." The commander nodded. He said something quiet to the operators beside him, too low for Emma to catch, and they separated without discussion, one taking a position near the ER entrance, the other moving to a spot that would give him sightlines to both the trauma bay and the corridor. Not aggressive, not threatening, just placed. The way you place furniture when you're serious about the room's function. Emma walked. The commander fell into step beside her, not behind her, not leading, beside. That too was a choice. She pushed open the consultation room door and reached for the light switch. The fluorescence hummed on, casting everything in that specific hospital pallor that made every conversation feel vaguely medical, regardless of what it was actually about. There was a table, 4 chairs, a whiteboard with the ghost of someone's diagram still visible through the erasing. She pulled out a chair and sat down without waiting to be invited. He sat across from her and placed a single manila folder on the table between them, closed, and left it there. She looked at it. "You're not going to tell me your name," she said. "Reeves," he said. "Commander Daniel Reeves, JSOC, attached to a unit you won't find in any directory." She absorbed this. "And you've been looking for me." "For 14 months. He said it without apology or drama, just a fact, delivered like a number. "We had a general location, Colorado. We lost the trail after you changed employers twice." "I wasn't hiding." "No," he agreed. "You weren't. That made it harder, not easier. People who are actively hiding leave patterns. People who are just trying to live their lives are invisible." Emma looked at the folder again. "The patient. His name is Warren Holt, Deputy Director, Defense Intelligence. He was operating in a non-official capacity, which is why there's no ID in the system that would have flagged him when he came in." Reeves paused. The identification tag you saw was a failsafe, something we put in place for situations exactly like this one, where he ends up in a civilian medical facility and needs the right person to find him. Emma felt the pieces rearrange. The tag was meant to find me. It was meant to find anyone with the right background who happened to be on shift. He looked at her steadily. Finding you specifically was a better outcome than we had any right to expect. She sat with that for a moment. Outside, through the thin wall, she could hear the ER resuming, tentatively, the way a machine restarts after a power interruption, each system coming back online with a little more uncertainty than before. "Holt," she said. "What was he carrying?" Reeves opened the folder. There were documents inside. She could see they were photocopies, not originals, and photographs, and what looked like a printed chain of communications that had been highlighted in several places. He turned them toward her but didn't spread them out. Just enough for her to see that there was substance here. "Wait." Holt had been building a case for 11 months, Reeves said. Financial fraud, primarily. But it connects to medical billing, procurement contracts, a network of shell companies that have been siphoning federal healthcare funds through affiliated institutions. He let that sit. Some of those institutions are civilian hospitals. Emma went very still. Reeves watched her process this with the patience of someone who had delivered information in high-stakes contexts before, and understood that the quality of a person's response was almost always proportional to how much space you gave them to think. "Redwood Valley," she said. It wasn't a question. Redwood Valley is one of 7 facilities identified in the case. He pulled one sheet forward, a financial summary. Numbers in columns that she couldn't fully read from her angle but could see were substantial. The contracts have been running for approximately 4 years. Someone inside the hospital's administrative structure has been facilitating the fraud. Holt was here to gather the last piece of documentation he needed to bring a federal case. Emma looked at the whiteboard across the room. The ghost diagram. Some previous consultation, some previous problem someone had tried to think through in this exact chair. "And someone shot him," she said. "Someone shot him." Reeves closed the folder. "Which tells us the case was closer to complete than whoever's running this operation was comfortable with." She turned back to him. "Why me? 14 months. Why not just—" She stopped, reformulated. "If you knew what hospital he was coming to, why did you need me?" "We didn't know which hospital." Holt was mobile. He was working independently because the channels he would normally use had been compromised. Reeves's voice stayed even, but there was something behind it, not apology, but the acknowledgement of a situation that had not gone according to anyone's plan. "He was shot 3 hours ago, 40 minutes outside Ashford, while driving to a location we didn't have eyes on. The paramedics brought him here because it was closest. We were tracking his vehicle's emergency beacon. That's how we got here as fast as we did." "And me?" "Your file was flagged 14 months ago by a protocol we run on all civilian medical facilities in regions where DI personnel operate. You came up as a potential asset, someone with the background to provide emergency care in a situation like tonight's if our people couldn't reach him in time." He paused. "That protocol saved his life tonight." "You saved his life tonight." Emma rubbed her face with both hands. She was aware that she was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the physical exertion of the last hour. More the exhaustion of a conversation that was pulling up things she had put down carefully and stored in places she didn't visit. "I left," she said. 7 years ago, I left, and I made a deliberate decision to— "I know what decision you made." "Then you know I'm not in a position to be anyone's asset." "That's not why I'm here." He said it simply, without pressure. "I'm not recruiting you. I'm here because Warren Holt is alive because of what you did in that trauma bay, and because the people who shot him are connected to this hospital, and because you are now, whether you want to be or not, part of this situation." The word situation landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Emma put her hands flat on the table. She was thinking about Langley, about the way he had stood at the corridor entrance watching Reeves, about the 11 months she'd spent at this hospital watching him operate. The favoritism, the intimidation, the buried complaints, the staff who had learned to arrange themselves around his moods like furniture shifted to accommodate a difficult door. She had filed it away, that accumulating picture, because she had been trying not to be someone who made things difficult, who raised problems, who drew attention. She had been trying, for a long time, to be the kind of quiet that doesn't get noticed. "Tell me about the administrative structure," she said. Reeves looked at her for a moment. Then he reached into the folder again. They spent 35 minutes in that room. Emma learned more about Redwood Valley Medical Center in those 35 minutes than she had gathered in 11 months of working there, which was itself a kind of information about how much you could miss when you were focused on surviving a place rather than understanding it. Reeves walked her through the financial architecture with the precision of someone who had been briefed thoroughly: the procurement contracts, the billing irregularities, the pattern of payments to a holding company registered in a state neither of them had ever visited. He showed her a photograph, grainy, taken at a distance, of a meeting that had occurred 6 months ago between two men she didn't recognize and one she did. Dr. Victor Langley, in a restaurant in Denver, with men Reeves identified, without elaborating, as persons of interest in Holt's investigation. Emma looked at the photograph for a long time. "He knew," she said, not with surprise, with the flat, settling recognition of something you've suspected forming itself into certainty. "He's not the architect," Reeves said. "He's a facilitator, someone who found it useful to look the other way and was compensated for the looking." He paused. "Which doesn't make him less culpable. It makes him specifically culpable for a different set of things." "The errors," Emma said. She was thinking out loud now, which was not something she normally permitted herself in professional contexts, but the hour and the information and the exhaustion had worn the habit down. The buried reports. He wasn't just protecting his ego, he was protecting the billing. Reeves didn't confirm or deny. He didn't need to. The geometry was clear enough. Emma pushed back her chair and stood. The room felt smaller than it had 35 minutes ago, not physically, but in the way that rooms felt smaller when you understood what had been happening inside them. "What do you need from me?" she asked. "Right now? Nothing." Reeves stood as well. "Holt is in surgery. When he's stable, we'll move him to a secure facility. Federal investigators are already on their way to Ashford. They'll be here by morning." He looked at her steadily. "What I need from you is to not disappear." "I already got suspended." "I know." Something moved in his expression, not quite wry, but adjacent. "That situation may resolve itself faster than Dr. Langley is expecting." They walked back to the ER together. Whatever Emma had expected to find when she came through those doors again, she hadn't expected what she got. The controlled chaos of the earlier hour had settled into something different, a tense, unhappy stillness, the kind that forms when a group of people all know that something has changed, but none of them have been told what. The operators Reeves had left in position were still there, still placed with that deliberate, non-threatening precision, but their presence had clearly been enough. The staff were doing their jobs with the careful concentration of people who had decided that looking busy was the safest option available. Langley was gone from the corridor entrance. Emma noticed the absence the way you notice a sound stopping. The stillness left by it was its own kind of information. "Where's Langley?" she asked Della, who was near the medication station and who looked at Emma with the expression of someone who had spent the last half hour revising their understanding of several things simultaneously. "He went to his office," Della said quietly. "About 20 minutes ago. He got a phone call." Emma and Reeves exchanged a look. Reeves said something into the radio clipped to his collar, too low, too abbreviated for Emma to follow, and one of the operators moved toward the corridor without being told twice. The night did not improve from there. Over the next 2 hours, Redwood Valley Medical Center became a different kind of place. It happened incrementally. 2 federal agents arrived in plain clothes and spoke at length with hospital administration in the boardroom on the 3rd floor, from which raised voices were audible in the hallway at several points. A second team, 4 people Emma didn't recognize, carrying equipment cases, arrived and established a working space in the conference room adjacent to the ER. Reeves moved between these operations with the calm efficiency of someone managing multiple pressure points simultaneously, and Emma watched him do it with the grudging recognition that he was good at this in the specific way that the best soldiers were good at things, not through visible effort, but through the absence of wasted motion. She was not officially on shift anymore. She was also not officially suspended because the paperwork for that hadn't been filed yet, and because no one had come to escort her out. And because the security guard who had been about to do that earlier had apparently received a communication that caused him to reconsider his priorities. She stayed. She wasn't sure exactly why. Some mix of the information Reeves had given her and the patient in the OR and the photograph of Langley in the Denver restaurant and 7 years of carrying something she'd put down on purpose but apparently hadn't put down far enough. She stayed and she made herself useful, covering a patient in Bay 2 whose nurse had been pulled into a briefing, answering questions from Harmon, who looked increasingly like a person watching a building they'd worked in for years reveal a structural problem they couldn't unsee. "Did you know?" he asked her at one point. They were near the coffee station. It was after 2 in the morning. "About the fraud?" "No." She poured coffee into a cup she wasn't sure was clean. "About Langley being the kind of person who could be bought?" "I suspected something was wrong, not the specifics." Harmon was quiet for a moment. He was a genuinely young man. She sometimes forgot how young, because competent people in crisis situations shed some of their youth, and right now he looked exactly his age. "The reports he made me revise," Harmon said carefully. 3 of them since I started. Patient outcome reports. He said they needed to be aligned with the standard of care documentation. I understood what he was asking. I just didn't want to think about what it meant. Emma looked at him. "Tell that to the federal investigators when they ask." He blinked. "You think they'll ask me?" "I think they're going to talk to everyone." She put the coffee down. "Don't minimize what you saw. Don't elaborate either. Just tell them exactly what happened, including what he said and what you did. The documentation will matter." Harmon nodded slowly. He looked like a person making a decision he'd been putting off for months without realizing he was doing it. Emma picked the coffee back up and moved on. At 3:14 a.m., the OR called down. The surgeon, a woman named Dr. Priya Anand, who ran the overnight surgical team and who had, as far as Emma could tell, nothing to do with Langley's network, came to find Reeves in the conference room. Emma was in the hallway nearby when it happened, so she heard it. "He's out," Anand said. Her voice was controlled but carrying the specific flatness of someone coming down from a long, difficult surgery. "We repaired the hemothorax, addressed the arterial bleed. It's going to be a recovery, but he's stable. He'll live." Reeves closed his eyes for exactly 1 second. "The hemorrhage control," Anand said. "Whoever did that in the trauma bay, that's what kept him viable long enough for us to get in there." She paused. "I've been doing trauma surgery for 14 years. I've never seen that technique applied by a civilian provider." "Where did she train?" Reeves glanced toward the hallway. Emma stepped back from the doorframe, but not fast enough. Anand saw her, looked at her with the direct, unhurried assessment of one medical professional evaluating another. "Military?" Anand said. Emma said nothing. Anand gave a short nod. Not approval exactly, more the acknowledgement of something that had explained itself without requiring elaboration. "Nice work," she said, and walked away, because she had other patients and a surgical team to debrief, and a night that wasn't over yet. Emma stood in the hallway with the cold coffee and let herself feel, just for a moment, the thing she hadn't allowed herself to feel since she stepped up to that table. The knowledge that she had been right. About the wound, about the technique, about the 4 minutes that had stood between Warren Holt and a different outcome. She had been right, and she had been told to back off, and she had been threatened, and she had done it anyway, and the man was alive. It didn't feel triumphant. It felt like work completed under conditions that should have been different. That was always what it felt like. Reeves appeared beside her. He'd developed a quality that she was starting to recognize. The ability to materialize in peripheral vision without triggering alarm. It was a useful trait for someone in his line of work. "I owe you a more complete briefing," he said. "There are things about Holt's investigation that are relevant to your situation here." "My situation is that I'm suspended." "Your situation," he said, "is considerably more complicated than that. And I think you know it." She looked at him. He was right, and they both knew it, so she didn't bother saying so. "There's a secondary layer to what Holt found," Reeves said. They were walking, moving away from the conference room, finding the kind of low-traffic hallway that hospitals have between 2 and 4 in the morning, the quiet corridors where the building breathes. The billing fraud was the primary case, But attached to it, running alongside it for the last 2 years, is a pattern of personnel actions against specific staff members, complaints filed against people who raised questions, terminations, suspensions, forced resignations. It's documented. He paused. Several of those cases involve nurses. Emma kept walking. One of them involves you, he said. She stopped. Reeves stopped too and turned to face her. In the fluorescent quiet of the hallway, his expression had the quality of someone delivering something he would have preferred not to have to deliver. 6 months ago, he said, Langley filed a formal communication with the Colorado State Board of Nursing. It contained a series of allegations about your professional conduct, unspecified errors, concerns about judgment under pressure. It was framed as a preliminary notice, not a formal complaint. The kind of thing that sits in a file and doesn't do much on its own. He paused. Except that it would have been the foundation for a formal complaint if you'd ever done anything that gave him an opening. The math assembled itself in Emma's head with a clarity that was almost physical. Tonight, she said. He was going to use tonight to complete it. Reeves held her gaze. The suspension he recommended, the protocol violation claim, that would have been the trigger. A formal complaint to the board, built on a record he'd been constructing for 6 months. Your license would have been under review within 30 days. Emma breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth. It was a technique for keeping things calibrated that she had learned in a context she usually didn't think about. He knew who I was, she said. Not specifically, but your background, the gaps in your employment history, the clinical skills that exceeded your documented training, the way you operated under pressure. It flagged for someone. Someone told Langley you were a risk, not to patient care, to the arrangement. She stood with that for a moment. The hallway, the fluorescent hum, the distant sound of the hospital maintaining itself through the hours when most of the people in it were asleep. He was setting me up, she said, 6 months ago, before tonight. Tonight just gave him a cleaner opportunity. Reeves's voice was even. Which is why tonight's footage matters. The hospital security system has cameras in the trauma bay. We've already requested the full archive, not just tonight, but the past year. He let that register. Every incident he used to build the preliminary notice. Every override, every correction, every interaction between you two. It's all on tape. Emma looked at the wall. And the board filing, she said, will be reviewed in the context of Holt's investigation. He paused. The investigators are going to want to speak with you about tonight and about the last 11 months. I need you to be prepared for that. I've been prepared for difficult conversations my whole career, she said. He almost smiled. Not quite. Something that passed through his expression like light through a narrow window, brief and gone. I know, he said. I've read your file. They stood in the hallway for another moment, and then Emma heard it. A sound from the direction of the 3rd floor that was not the usual sound of a hospital operating overnight. Voices, more than one. The tonal quality of an exchange that had moved past disagreement into something more urgent. One of the voices was Langley's. She recognized it by its register. The particular pitch of a man who had spent years not having to explain himself to anyone now confronted with a situation in which explanation was insufficient. Reeves touched the radio at his collar. The response came back fast, clipped, and whatever it said made his jaw set in a way it hadn't been set before. He looked at Emma. Langley just attempted to access the hospital's billing records remotely, he said, from his office. He's trying to delete files. The hallway between them and the stairwell was 40 feet long. They were already moving. The stairwell door hit the wall when Reeves pushed through it, and Emma was right behind him, not thinking about the suspension or the preliminary complaint or the 7 years she'd spent trying to be someone who didn't run toward problems. The 3rd floor corridor was lit and empty in the way that administration floors were empty at this hour. Offices dark, the carpet absorbing their footsteps. At the far end, Langley's office light was on, visible through the frosted glass panel of his door. The federal agent who'd arrived earlier, a woman named Ortega, who had introduced herself with the economy of someone who introduces herself exactly as many times as necessary, stepped out of an adjacent office as they reached the corridor. He triggered the deletion protocol 3 minutes ago, she said to Reeves. We've got a mirror on the server. Everything he's deleting is being captured in real time, but he doesn't know that. She paused. He also called someone 40 seconds ago. We got the number. It's one of the contacts from Holt's documentation. Reeves was quiet for a moment. Let him finish the call, he said. Ortega nodded once and stepped back. Emma stood in the hallway outside Victor Langley's office, in the building where she had spent 11 months being told, in various ways, that her judgment didn't count, and her skills didn't qualify, and her past didn't matter, and listened to the sound of a man trying to save himself from consequences that had been building for years. Through the frosted glass, she could see his shape, standing, moving, the tense silhouette of someone who had lost the ability to sit still. The call ended. The shape behind the glass stopped moving, and then slowly it sat down. Ortega's phone buzzed. She looked at it, then at Reeves. The number he called, she said. It just went active. They're tracing it now. A pause. There's a second location. What location? Reeves said. Ortega looked up from the phone. Her expression had changed. The professional composure was still there, but something had sharpened underneath it, the look of someone recalibrating risk in real time. There's someone else in this building, she said. Someone who's been here since before we arrived. The word someone sat in the hallway like a live wire. Reeves moved first. He touched his radio again. 2 short transmissions, each answered in the clipped syllables of operators who had already shifted into a different register, and then turned to Emma with an expression that was not panic but was adjacent to urgency in a way she hadn't seen from him yet. How many access points to this floor? He asked her. She thought fast. 11 months of working a building you mostly tried not to think about had still deposited a floor plan in her memory, whether she'd wanted it to or not. Stairwell we came up. Emergency exit at the north end, alarmed, but the alarm's been bypassed before. The facilities manager mentioned it 2 months ago. Elevator, but it's logged. She paused. There's a service corridor behind the records room. It connects to the east stairwell. Reeves relayed this in fragments to his radio. Ortega had already moved down the corridor, her hand near the holster at her hip, in the specific way of someone who wasn't drawing but wasn't not drawing either. What kind of someone? Emma said. Reeves looked at her. The call Langley made, the number that went active, it pinged a device that's inside this building, sub-basement or first floor originally, but the signal's moved. It's been moving for the last 6 minutes. Moving toward what? He didn't answer, which was itself an answer. Emma thought about Warren Holt. In the surgical recovery suite on the second floor, sedated, monitored, alive because of 4 minutes and a technique from a training room in Texas. Alive and in possession, presumably, of whatever physical documentation he'd been carrying when the paramedics brought him in. She'd seen the jacket come open. She'd seen the tag. But she hadn't seen what else might have been on him, what else might have been in the lining of that jacket or the interior pocket of his pants, what else a deputy director running a solo intelligence operation might carry on his person when he drives toward an evidence handoff and gets shot 40 minutes outside his destination. The recovery suite, she said. Reeves's expression confirmed it without confirming it. Then we need to move, she said. He looked at her for exactly 1 second, the assessment of someone deciding how much of a variable she was going to be. And then he said, stay close and stay behind me, which she interpreted as agreement. They took the east stairwell. Reeves went first, one hand on the railing, moving with the controlled speed of someone who had cleared stairwells before and understood that the momentum you build going down is also momentum you can't easily stop. Emma was behind him, close enough to respond to whatever he found at the bottom, but far enough that she wasn't in his way. She was aware that she was wearing scrubs and clogs and had no weapon and no tactical training in the specific sense that Reeves and his operators had it. She had other training, different training, the kind that was more about stabilizing situations than controlling them. But she knew this building and he didn't, and right now that was its own form of advantage. Second floor landing, the door to the surgical recovery wing. Reeves stopped and pressed himself against the wall beside the doorframe. He held up a closed fist. Wait. And Emma stopped behind him and waited, which took more discipline than moving would have. Through the small reinforced window in the door, she could see the recovery corridor. Dim, the overhead fluorescents on their night setting, the nurse's station visible at the far end with one staff member visible at the desk, head bent over something. Normal. Quiet. Reeves held the position for 10 seconds, then he pushed through the door. The staff member at the desk looked up. A night nurse named Torres, Emma recognized her, early 40s, competent and unbothered by most things, and her expression moved through surprise and into a sharp, professional alertness when she saw Reeves's gear. "The patient in Suite 4, Reeves said quietly. "Has anyone been through here in the last 15 minutes? Torres opened her mouth. Then the lights went out. Not a flicker. A complete cut. The whole corridor dropping into the darkness that hospitals reserve for genuine emergencies rather than the minor failures that get handled by the backup system. Because the backup system didn't come on. The emergency generators, which should have activated within 4 seconds of a primary power failure, produced nothing but a distant mechanical stutter that suggested something had interrupted them before they could cycle. Emma had her phone out before the 4 seconds were up, flashlight on. Reeves had a tactical light on his vest that he activated in the same motion. Torres had not moved from behind the desk, which spoke well of her nerve. "Suite 4, Emma said, and they moved. The door to Suite 4 was closed. Reeves tried the handle, unlocked, which was hospital standard, and pushed it open fast and low, stepping through with his light sweeping the room in the practiced arc of someone who had done this in conditions significantly worse than a darkened hospital room. Empty. Not Holt. Holt was in the bed, unconscious, the monitors running on their internal battery backup, which gave them approximately 40 minutes. But the chair beside the bed, which had held one of Reeves's operators when Emma had passed this room 2 hours ago, was empty. The operator was gone. "Kaufman," Reeves said into his radio. Nothing came back. Emma crossed to the bed and checked Holt's vitals by habit. Pulse present, respiration steady. The monitor readings within acceptable parameters for a man 6 hours out of major surgery. He hadn't been touched. She looked at his left hand where the IV line ran, and at the monitoring leads on his chest, and at the call button still clipped to the bedrail. "He's okay," she said. "Not disturbed." "Then why cut the power?" Reeves said. He was at the window now, looking at the parking lot 3 stories below where his vehicles sat, their headlights activated by some automatic protocol that had kicked in when the building went dark. Emma looked at the room, at the IV pole, at the cardiac monitor, at the standardized intake documentation clipped to the board at the end of the bed, which listed Holt's name as the John Doe designation the paramedics had used, but which also listed, in the standard fields, the inventory of personal effects that had been removed from the patient on arrival. She pulled the board off the hook and held her phone light over it. Personal effects. Jacket, gray, belt, keys, vehicle, single, contents of left interior jacket pocket, laminated identification card, non-standard. She flipped to the second page. Contents of right interior jacket pocket, USB drive, black, thumb size. Currently held in patient property lockbox, room 4. She looked at the lockbox mounted on the wall beside the closet. It was open. The small padlock that should have been securing the hasp was on the floor. It hadn't been cut or broken. It had been opened with the correct combination. The box inside was empty. Emma's throat tightened. "Someone took his property," she said. "The USB drive he was carrying. It's gone." Reeves turned from the window. He looked at the lockbox, and then at her, and then he was on the radio again. And this time the transmissions were not calm and brief. They were fast and clipped, and she caught fragments. "North stairwell, third man, ID the device, do not let him exit the building." She understood the shape of it now. The second location Ortega had identified, the moving signal. The power cut, not to harm Holt, but to buy 90 seconds of darkness and confusion, while someone who already knew the combination to that lockbox, someone who had been inside this building before Reeves and his team arrived, walked into this room and took the only piece of evidence that Holt had been physically carrying. "Who knew the combination?" she said. Reeves's jaw was set. "Standard hospital property protocol. The combination is assigned by the admissions office. Langley has access to admissions. We know." They were in the hallway again, moving. Torres had activated the ward's emergency protocol. She'd called it in when the lights cut, doing exactly what she was trained to do. and the floor was starting to rouse, night staff emerging from rooms with flashlights, and the wary efficiency of people running a checklist they knew by memory. The emergency lights came on. Not the full overheads, the battery-backed emergency strips, running at about 30% of normal illumination, enough to see by but not enough to eliminate shadows. The generator stutter from below resolved into something more sustained, and then the backup power came online, partial and stuttering, and the elevator panel at the end of the corridor lit up. The elevator was on its way up. Emma watched the floor indicator. Basement. 1, 2. "He's coming up," she said. Reeves had positioned himself at the corner where the corridor turned toward the elevator bank, and when the doors opened, he was ready. Tactical light up, body behind the corner's edge, voice carrying the flat command authority of someone who doesn't need to shout to be heard. "Don't move." The elevator held a man Emma had never seen before. Mid-30s, civilian clothes, dark jacket, dark jeans, built like someone who had once been in a physical profession and had maintained enough of it to still matter. He had a bag over one shoulder and his hands were at his sides, and his expression, when the light hit him, was the specific blankness of someone who has run through their options and arrived at a position they don't love but understand. He put his hands up slowly. Reeves moved in. One of his operators appeared from the north stairwell door. Kaufman, Emma realized. So the operator wasn't compromised but had been tracking from a different angle, and they had the man out of the elevator and against the wall in under 15 seconds. The bag came off his shoulder. Reeves unzipped it without ceremony. The USB drive was inside. Also a phone? Also a folded document that he didn't open yet. "Who sent you?" Reeves said. The man said nothing. "You're inside a federal investigation," Reeves said. "That's not a threat. That's a description of your current situation. Whoever you made your last call to is already known to us. The question is whether you want to be the person who gets ahead of this or the person who goes down with it." The man was quiet for another beat. Then, "I want a lawyer." "That's a reasonable thing to want," Reeves said. "You'll get one." He looked at Kaufman. "Get him downstairs. Ortega takes custody." Kaufman moved. The man went without resistance, which told Emma something about him, that he'd assessed the situation and decided that fighting it was the worst option. That was the behavior of someone who'd been in legal jeopardy before and knew what the calculus looked like. Emma exhaled. The emergency lighting hummed around them, that half-lit corridor feeling suddenly less urgent without the moving target in it. She became aware that her hands were cold, hospital cold, the specific chill of buildings that keep their temperature calibrated for equipment rather than people, and that she hadn't eaten since 6 o'clock the previous evening. Reeves was looking at the USB drive. "Is that enough?" she said. "Combined with what Holt's been building, combined with the server mirror we have on Langley's deletion attempt, combined with the financial records?" He turned it in his fingers. "It should be." He paused. "Should be" is doing some work in that sentence. "It usually does," she said. He looked at her with that almost expression again. "How are you holding up?" The question caught her off guard. Not because it was strange, because it was direct, delivered without the clinical distance that most people used when asking about a state they didn't actually want the full answer to. "I'm functional," she said. "That's not what I asked." She looked at the wall. The emergency lighting did something unflattering to every surface, made the hallway look like the interior of something industrial rather than medical. And she thought about the last 7 years, the deliberate quietness of them, the choice to put down the parts of herself that had made her good at situations exactly like this one, and how completely that choice had apparently failed to stick. "I'll let you know when I figure it out," she said. He accepted this without pushing, which she appreciated. They moved back toward the stairwell. Below them, the sound of the hospital was changing again, activity concentrating on certain floors, the specific acoustics of an institution responding to multiple simultaneous events. Emma's phone buzzed. She looked at it. Della, texting from the ER. Langley's not in his office. Security can't find him. She showed the phone to Reeves without saying anything. His expression shifted. Not dramatically, a narrowing around the eyes, a compression of the jaw, but she'd been reading people in high-pressure situations long enough to know what that shift meant. "When?" he said into his radio. The answer came back and Emma couldn't hear it, but she watched his face and that was sufficient. He left his office 14 minutes ago, Reeves said. The camera on the third-floor corridor picked him up heading toward the north stairwell. He paused. We've been focused on the second floor. Emma ran the building in her head. Third floor, administration, Langley's office, the boardroom, the medical records archive, physical records, the paper files that predated the hospital's digital transition, and that a man careful enough to build a 6-month preliminary complaint against a nurse he considered a threat might have additional documentation stored in. Or the north stairwell, which led to the roof access. Or the service corridor on the first floor that connected to the loading dock. The loading dock, she said. There's a service exit. Vehicles come and go overnight for supply deliveries. The dock cameras run on a separate circuit that the facilities manager has been trying to get upgraded for 2 years. If the main power cut affected them, Reeves was already moving. They took the stairs at a speed that Emma's knees registered and her training ignored, emerging into the first-floor service corridor at a jog. The emergency lighting thinner here, the ceiling lower, the institutional plainness of the back of house that patients never saw. She was ahead of him now because she knew this corridor, and he didn't. The left turn at the linen supply junction, the right at the equipment bay, the push through the fire door that opened onto the loading dock. Cold air hit her. The loading dock was wide and low lit, the dock lights on a separate circuit that had survived whatever had taken the main power. 3 trucks sat at varying stages of delivery positions, their engines off at this hour. The dock itself was empty of people, except at the far end, where the dock ramp descended to the service road, a figure was moving, not running, walking fast, the gait of a man trying very hard not to look like he was fleeing, which was its own kind of tell. Dark coat, silver hair visible even at this distance and this light level. Langley. He had a briefcase. He had his keys in his hand. And he had reached the bottom of the dock ramp and was 20 feet from a dark sedan that Emma did not recognize as a hospital vehicle. Langley! Reeves's voice cracked across the dock like something physical. Langley stopped. He turned slowly. In the dock light, his face was doing something complicated. The architecture of his authority, the particular structure of a man who had spent decades building a version of himself that didn't get told no, was visibly straining against the reality of the moment. He looked at Reeves, then at Emma. At Emma, his expression did something she hadn't expected. Not contempt, that she would have recognized. Something closer to the specific hatred of a person who has been beaten by something they had specifically, deliberately tried to eliminate. You have no jurisdiction here, he said to Reeves. I am the chief of surgery at this institution, and I have legal counsel. You're not under arrest, Reeves said. He was walking toward Langley at a measured pace, not rushing, and Emma was moving laterally, away from his line to avoid clustering. You're being asked to stop walking to that car. On what basis? On the basis that the federal investigators upstairs would like to speak with you, and you left before they had the opportunity. Reeves stopped 10 feet from him. And on the basis that the vehicle you're approaching is registered to a holding company currently under federal review. Langley's grip on the briefcase tightened. Emma could see it from where she'd stopped. His knuckles, the pressure in his forearm, the calculation running behind his eyes that was trying to find a version of this moment where he came out ahead and finding, probably for the first time in a very long time, that no such version existed. This is a misunderstanding, he said. I've done nothing that isn't documented and defensible. Then you have nothing to worry about, Reeves said. Come back inside. A long moment, the cold air, the dock lights, the distant sound of the highway somewhere beyond the service road. Normal life proceeding at 4 a.m. with no knowledge of this loading dock or this building or the last 5 hours of everything that had happened inside it. Langley looked at Emma again. You, he said. The word was almost admiring in how much contempt it compressed. A nurse. I had you handled. Emma looked back at him. She was tired and cold, and her arm still ached from the compression, and she had not eaten since yesterday evening, and she was standing on a loading dock at 4 a.m. telling herself to say nothing. Nothing. Let Reeves handle it. This is not the moment. You had me filed, she said. There's a difference. He stared at her. Then he reached into his coat pocket. Reeves moved, fast. The explosive compression of someone who had been calibrating exactly how much distance he needed and had kept himself exactly within it, and his hand closed on Langley's wrist before whatever was in the pocket cleared it. Not a weapon. A phone, which Langley had been reaching for, and which now sat in Reeves's hand while Langley stood with the expression of a man who had just made his last available move and watched it fail. "Inside," Reeves said. "Now." And Langley, who had controlled this hospital for a decade, who had filed preliminary complaints and buried reports and intimidated staff and facilitated fraud, and built himself into something that looked, from the inside of Redwood Valley Medical Center, approximately like permanence, walked back up the loading dock ramp without another word. Emma followed. She was 3 steps behind Langley and 2 steps behind Reeves when her phone buzzed again. She looked at it in the elevator on the way back up, thinking it was Della again, expecting another update about the ER or the staff or the federal activity spreading through the building's upper floors. It wasn't Della. It was a number she didn't recognize. The text was 6 words. "Holt is awake. He's asking for you." She read the text twice. The number was not in her contacts. The message was not from Reeves. He was standing 2 feet away from her in the elevator, watching Langley, and his phone hadn't moved. She turned the screen toward him without speaking, and he looked at it, and his expression went through something quick and difficult to name before settling back into its default flatness. "Who has this number?" she said quietly. "Holt's team," he said. "The ones we couldn't reach before tonight." He looked at the number again. "He has people outside the official chain. That's how he was running the investigation solo." The elevator stopped on 2. The doors opened and Reeves handed Langley off to Kaufman with a look that communicated everything necessary without a word, and then he and Emma were moving down the recovery corridor again, the emergency lighting still running its half-illumination, the ward quiet in the way of a place that has processed its crisis and is now in the slower, stranger phase of aftermath. Torres was at the desk. She looked up when they came through. "He woke up about 8 minutes ago," she said. "Disoriented initially, which is normal post-anesthesia, but he's oriented now. He asked for water, then he asked for—" She glanced at Emma. "You, by name." Emma absorbed this. "He knew your name," Torres added. "Didn't ask for a doctor, didn't ask for administration, didn't ask who was in charge. Just asked for Emma Whitaker." Reeves said nothing. He gestured toward Suite 4 with a slight tilt of his head, which Emma interpreted correctly as "you first." She pushed the door open. Warren Holt looked like a man who had been shot and operated on, which was to say he looked considerably worse than he'd looked when he arrived, because now he was conscious and the full inventory of his condition was available to his face. He was gray and sweating slightly, his left side wrapped and his right arm running the IV line, and his eyes, when they found Emma in the doorway, had the careful focus of someone who has trained themselves to be sharp under conditions that would excuse being otherwise. He was older than she'd clocked from across a trauma bay, late 40s maybe, with the specific kind of weathering that came from a career spent operating in the friction zone between what was officially happening and what was actually happening. "Whitaker," he said. His voice was rough from the intubation, words coming carefully. "They told me you were the one who—" He stopped, took a breath that cost him something. "The compression. Yes, that technique." He looked at her with the recognition of someone placing a reference. "Where did you—" "Fort Bliss," she said. 2017. Advanced Combat Casualty Care, Classified Curriculum. He held her gaze. "Sergeant Kwan's course." Something moved through her chest. Not quite surprise, more the electric quality of a connection made across a gap she'd thought was permanent. "You know it." "I helped fund it," he said, "before it got cut in the 2019 budget review." He paused. "Small world." "Small enough," she said. She moved to the bed and did what she would have done for any post-surgical patient. Checked the monitor readings, the IV rate, the dressing, the color of his nail beds. He let her do it without comment, which suggested he understood that this was not performance, that she was actually looking at things that mattered. "The drive," he said while she was checking his pulse. "Is it—" "We have it," Reeves said from the doorway. Holt exhaled. The release of tension in his body was visible from the outside, a measurable physical event. They got close. They got the box open. They didn't get out of the building. The combination was Langley's, Holt said. We knew he'd have access. That was intentional. I wanted him to make a move before he understood what we had on the server. He looked at Reeves. Did he delete? Tried. We had a mirror running. Holt's mouth moved in something that was not quite a smile, but was in the same neighborhood. Good. He shifted against the pillow, and the shift cost him. A quick tightening around his eyes, controlled and suppressed but visible to anyone paying attention. I need to give a statement. Everything I've been building, the chain of the fraud, the personnel actions, the contact list, all of it, it needs to be on record tonight, before his lawyers arrive. Investigators are upstairs, Reeves said. Then bring them down. Holt looked at Emma. I want her in the room. Emma blinked. I don't have any standing in an investigation. You have standing as a witness, Holt said. Langley filed a preliminary complaint against you 6 months ago. That complaint is part of the personnel action pattern that constitutes one count of the obstruction case. He paused. You're not a bystander in this. You're documented. Emma stood at the side of his bed and thought about 6 months ago. She had been doing overtime in October, pulling extra shifts because the rent on her apartment in Ashford was higher than she'd expected, and the hospital's pay scale was not generous to night rotation nurses with 11 months of tenure. She'd had no idea that Langley was constructing something. She'd had no idea there was a file with her name on it sitting in a Board of Nursing inbox, not filed but ready, waiting for the right moment the way a weapon waits in a holster. All right, she said. Reeves made the call. Torres brought Holt more water and adjusted the lighting and generally managed the suite with the competence of someone who had learned to work around unusual circumstances without requiring an explanation for them. Ortega arrived 12 minutes later with a colleague Emma hadn't met, a younger man named Vasquez who carried a recording device and the quiet intensity of someone who had been working this case from a desk in a federal building for months and was now finally in the same room as the person who had built it. Holt talked for 90 minutes. Emma sat in the chair beside his bed and listened to the architecture of 4 years of fraud assembled in the specific, measured language of someone who had been documenting it as carefully as a surgeon documents a procedure. Each step, each payment, each communication, each decision point where a person had chosen to participate or look away. The shell companies, the procurement contracts, the billing irregularities that had been structured to stay below the audit threshold individually while adding up to something substantial in aggregate. The network of administrators at 7 facilities, Redwood Valley among them, who had been compensated for their facilitation in ways that were designed to look like legitimate consulting arrangements. And then the other layer, the personnel actions. Holt walked through 14 cases, nurses, physicians, a billing administrator, a records coordinator, people who had raised questions or filed internal complaints, or simply demonstrated by their competence that the standard of care being documented didn't match the standard of care being delivered. In each case, the response had followed a pattern: escalating pressure, manufactured concerns about professional conduct, strategic complaints to licensing boards or HR systems, until the person left or was removed or became quiet enough to stop being a problem. Emma's case was the most recent. And Holt said, the most explicit in its documentation because Langley had become careless in the last 6 months, because the fraud had grown large enough that the stakes of exposure had moved him from careful to reactive. He filed the preliminary notice in October, Holt said, his voice holding steady despite the effort it cost him. The language he used, concerns about judgment under pressure, inconsistency between documented training and demonstrated clinical behavior, that's language designed to flag a licensing board before a formal complaint exists. It creates a record without triggering the formal process. He looked at Vasquez. That's obstruction of professional practice. It's also witness intimidation, if you can establish that he identified Whitaker as someone whose skills would expose his billing irregularities. Can you establish that? Vasquez asked. The communications on the drive, Holt said, include an email chain from 8 months ago. Langley discussing the nursing staff with one of his contacts in the network. He mentions Whitaker specifically. He paused. He describes her as a problem that needs to be managed before she figures out what she's looking at. The room was quiet. Emma was looking at the floor. She had a specific memory of October, of a Wednesday afternoon when Langley had passed her in the corridor near the medication station and given her a look she hadn't been able to fully interpret at the time. Not contempt, not the usual mild irritation, something more deliberate. She had filed it away and moved on because she was trying to be someone who didn't assign meaning to every look from a difficult superior, and now she understood that she had been right to register it and wrong to dismiss it. He had already been building the case against her. He had already decided she was a threat. She just hadn't known what kind of threat she was or why. "The email chain," Emma said. "Does it specify what he thought I was looking at?" Holt looked at her. "The billing for your unit. The trauma bay billing specifically, the procedure codes, the supply charges. You had flagged a discrepancy in March. Do you remember that?" She thought back. March. She had flagged a discrepancy in the supply charge documentation for a trauma case because the billed items didn't match the items she'd actually used. She'd mentioned it to the charge nurse, who'd mentioned it to administration, who told her it was a transcription error and corrected it. She had thought nothing of it. "I remember," she said. "That flag went to Langley's desk," Holt said. And 8 days later, he started building the preliminary complaint. Emma sat with this, at the precise, awful geometry of it, that the thing which had made her a target was not her military background, not her clinical skills, not some abstract threat she posed. It was one flagged discrepancy on a supply form. One moment of doing her job correctly. One Tuesday in March when she noticed a number that didn't match, and said so. The simplicity of it was almost worse than a complicated explanation would have been. Vasquez was still recording. Ortega was making notes. Reeves was near the door, listening with the stillness of someone who already knew most of what was being said, but understood the importance of having it said formally, on record, in the presence of witnesses. Holt shifted again. The pain was there in the shift, but he was managing it, and Emma appreciated that he wasn't performing toughness. He was just working despite discomfort, which was a different thing. "I need to rest soon," he said, "but I want to finish the chain first." He looked at Vasquez. The contact who received the email chain, the primary facilitator above Langley in the network. That individual is named in the drive documentation with bank records and a communication log going back 30 months. He paused. That individual currently holds a position on the Redwood Valley Hospital board. Ortega looked up from her notes. "Name?" she said. "Harold Fitch," Holt said. "Want you chairman of the board." The name landed in the room differently than names had been landing for the last hour. Ortega and Vasquez exchanged a look that was not alarm, but was the professional adjacent to alarm. The look of people adding a piece to a structure that was becoming larger than the original blueprint. "Fitch has been on the board for 6 years, Holt continued. "He recruited Langley for the chief of surgery position. He structured the consulting arrangements that funded the facilitation. He is, in the language of the federal case, the architect." He looked at Reeves. "Where is he, Ted?" "We have a current address," Reeves said. "He's not in the building." "He will be by morning," Holt said. "There's a board meeting scheduled for 7 a.m. It was on the hospital calendar when I checked the public records 3 days ago. He won't cancel it. Canceling would signal awareness, and he doesn't know yet how much we have." Ortega was already on her phone. Emma stood from the chair. Her legs had been still for 90 minutes, and they registered this with a stiffness that reminded her she had also been doing physical work in the hours before that. She walked to the window, not the view Reeves had used earlier to watch the parking lot, a different window on the east side that showed the beginning of what might eventually become dawn over the mountains, though it was still too dark to be certain. She thought about Harold Fitch, whom she had met exactly twice. A tall man with the kind of careful warmth that administrators learn as a professional skill. He had shaken her hand at a staff welcome event 11 months ago and said something generic about being glad to have dedicated nurses on the team. She had categorized him as a standard board type and thought nothing further. He had recruited Langley. He had built the network. He had been running this for 6 years. She heard Holt's voice behind her, quieter now, directed at Reeves. "The board complaint against Whitaker. I need that formally withdrawn before the morning. I don't want it sitting in the system while the board meeting happens." Reeves said something she didn't catch. "I know it's not standard sequence," Holt said. "I'm asking you to make it happen anyway. She's a witness and a subject of the obstruction count, and she should not be walking into tomorrow with that hanging over her. Emma turned from the window. Holt was looking at her. He looked exhausted. The particular exhaustion of a man who had been running a solo operation for 11 months and had been shot and operated on, and was now giving a formal statement from a hospital bed at 5 in the morning. But his eyes were still clear. "You didn't have to stay," he said to her. "After Reeves arrived. You could have walked out and let us handle it." "You needed people who knew the building," she said. "We had a floor plan." "A floor plan doesn't tell you the dock cameras run on a separate circuit." She looked at him steadily. "Or that the service corridor behind the records room connects to the east stairwell." He held her gaze for a moment. "No," he said, "it doesn't." She nodded once and turned to Reeves. "The board meeting is at 7. It's—" She checked the clock on the monitor. 5:12. "If Fitch arrives and nobody has told him what's happened here tonight, he'll walk into that meeting and proceed normally. That's your window." "We know," Reeves said. "Then you don't need me for the next 90 minutes, she said. "I'm going to the break room. I haven't eaten since yesterday." He almost smiled. "Third floor break room's been commandeered by the investigative team." "ER break room," she said. "First floor. There are granola bars in the cabinet above the coffee machine. Della thinks nobody knows about them, but everybody knows about them." She left the suite. The corridor was quiet. Torres gave her a nod as she passed the desk, the nod of someone who has been working the overnight shift long enough to understand that a person heading for the break room at 5 in the morning has earned the right to do so without commentary. The ER break room was empty. Emma found the granola bars exactly where she knew they would be, 3 of them, stacked behind a bag of coffee filters. And she sat down in one of the plastic chairs and ate one slowly and looked at nothing in particular and let the last 6 hours settle into something she could carry without actively holding. It wasn't over. She knew that. Fitch was still uncontained. The board meeting was 90 minutes away. There were investigators on 3 floors of this building doing work that would take weeks to fully resolve. And the formal processes, the licensing board review, the criminal referrals, the civil exposure for the hospital itself, would take months beyond that. Nothing was resolved. The shape of it was resolved. The mechanism was in motion. But resolved was a different thing. She ate the second granola bar. At 5:40, Della appeared in the break room doorway. She looked like a woman who had been running an ER through a crisis for the last 6 hours without ever being told the full story of the crisis, which was accurate. "Harmon's talking to the investigators," she said. "He's been in there for 40 minutes. "Good," Emma said. 3 other nurses asked if they could give statements. Martinez, Park, and Soto. "Also good." Della leaned against the door frame. She was a woman in her mid-50s who had been doing this job for 22 years and had seen things in ERs that most people would not want to see, and she had the particular quality of someone who has been absorbing information for hours and is now deciding what to do with it. "The preliminary complaint he filed," Della said, "against you." Emma looked at her. "I saw a copy," Della said, "back in November. He left a draft on the shared printer by mistake, or I assumed it was a mistake." She paused. "I should have told you." Emma held this. The information and the specific shape of Della's discomfort about it, not guilt exactly, but the thing that lives next to guilt when you made a reasonable decision under pressure, and it turned out to have a cost you didn't anticipate. "Why didn't you?" Emma said. Not accusatory, just asking. Della was quiet for a moment. "Because I have 18 years until retirement and 2 kids in college, and he controlled my schedule." She said it flatly, without self-pity or excessive apology, just as a fact, the way a fact deserves to be stated. That's not a justification, it's an explanation. Emma nodded. "Tell the investigators." "I'm going to." They sat in the break room in a silence that wasn't comfortable but wasn't hostile either, the silence of 2 people who worked the same building and were only now understanding what that building had actually been. At 6:15, Reeves appeared in the doorway. Emma looked at him. His expression had shifted again. Not urgency, not the operational flatness of the hours before. Something that might, in a different person and a different context, have been satisfaction, except that it was too careful for that. "Fitch," she said. "He arrived 20 minutes ago," Reeves said. Came in through the main entrance at 5:53. Went directly to his office on the 4th floor. He paused. He doesn't know yet. We wanted him settled before... Before what? Reeves looked at her for a beat. Before we asked you to be present when we went upstairs. Emma stood up. Why me? Because Holt asked, and because... He stopped. Chose different words. Because the complaint he filed against you was the thing that documented his intent most clearly. You have a right to be in the room when that documentation is used. She threw away the granola bar wrapper. All right. The 4th floor of Redwood Valley Medical Center was the executive level, the offices of the board members who kept offices there, the conference room where the board met, the quiet administrative machinery that ran the business side of the institution. Emma had been to this floor exactly once for an orientation meeting in her first week, and she had not been back. Harold Fitch's office had a view of the mountains. In the early light, real dawn now, the sky moving from black to the specific blue that came before color, the Rockies were visible through the glass as a dark mass against a brightening horizon. It was, objectively, a beautiful view. Emma noticed this and found it irrelevant. Fitch was behind his desk when Ortega and Reeves came through the door. Emma was behind them to the left. He looked up and his face did something that she catalogued carefully. The sequence of expressions that moved through a man who had been preparing himself for a difficult board meeting and was now confronted with federal law enforcement in his office at 6:20 in the morning. Surprise. Calculation. The decision, made quickly and badly, to project normalcy. Good morning, he said. The voice was exactly what she remembered, the careful warmth, the administrator's training. Is there something I can help you with? Ortega introduced herself and Vasquez, who had come up behind Emma. She cited the investigation. She cited the federal authority. She placed a document on Fitch's desk, a single printed page, which Emma couldn't read from where she stood, but which produced in Fitch's face the total collapse of the Normalcy Project. He looked at the page for a long time. Then he looked up, past Ortega, past Reeves, directly at Emma. His expression was not hatred the way Langley's had been. It was something stranger, the look of a man encountering the specific variable that had not been in his model. The nurse, the one Langley had been managing, the one who had flagged a supply form in March and started, without knowing it, the chain of events that had brought federal investigators to his office at 6:20 in the morning. I'd like to call my attorney, he said. Absolutely, Ortega said. You have that right. He reached for his phone, and Emma, standing in the doorway of his office with the mountains behind him turning gold in the first real light of morning, thought about March, about the supply form, about a Tuesday when she'd noticed a number that didn't match and said so because it was her job to notice things and say so, and how that single ordinary act had set something in motion that had taken 6 months to reach this room. She hadn't been trying to expose anything. She had just been doing her work. That, she thought, was the part they had never understood about her. Not Langley, not Fitch, not any of the people who had spent years treating her as a problem to be managed rather than a person doing a job. They had looked at her skills and her background and the gaps in her employment history and seen a threat to be neutralized. They had never considered the simpler explanation. She wasn't trying to take them down. She was just very good at her job. Fitch was speaking quietly into his phone. Ortega and Vasquez were at the desk. Reeves came to stand beside Emma in the doorway, and after a moment he said, low enough that only she could hear, Holt wants to see you again before we move him. He says there's something he didn't finish. Emma looked at Fitch, at the careful, crumbling architecture of him, the administrator's warmth stripped down to its materials, and then she looked away, because she had seen enough of that particular site, and turned toward the corridor. When? She said. Now, Reeves said. And Emma. He stopped. She looked at him. There's someone with him, Reeves said. Someone who arrived 20 minutes ago. I should have told you before we came up here, but I needed to... He stopped again, in the way of someone choosing words more carefully than usual. I needed you to be in that room first, for the record. She waited. It's a colonel from the Army Medical Command, he said. Her name is Garza. She came specifically because of you. A pause. She's been holding something for 7 years. Emma stood in the corridor of the executive floor of a hospital that was in the process of being dismantled around its own corruption and felt something move through her that she did not immediately have a name for. Not the past exactly. Something the past had been carrying that was about to be set down. "What is she holding?" Emma said. Reeves looked at her with an expression that was, for the first time since he'd walked into the ER, and said, "We've been looking for you, not measured or controlled or professionally calibrated." "Your record," he said. "The real one. The one that was classified when you separated." He paused. "She's here to give it back to you." Emma didn't say anything for a moment. The corridor was quiet around them, the specific quiet of a building that had spent the night in crisis and was now moving into the slower, stranger territory of consequence. Somewhere below, investigators were working. Langley was in federal custody. Fitch was on the phone with his attorney in the office behind them. The mountains through the window at the end of the hall had gone from gold to the clear, uncomplicated blue of early morning. 7 years. She had separated from the army at 22, which people who met her now sometimes registered with a slight recalibration. She didn't look like someone whose most formative years had happened in classified settings in countries she wasn't supposed to name. She had worked hard at that, at not looking like that, at building, layer by careful layer, the version of herself that lived in a small apartment in Ashford and pulled overnight shifts and flagged supply discrepancies and tried very deliberately to want a small and manageable life. The classified record was the thing she had traded for that life. Not officially. Officially, she had separated under honorable conditions, her service acknowledged in the standard language of someone who had completed their commitment without incident. But the specific record, the operations, the commendations that couldn't be named in a document that anyone might read, the account of what she had actually done in the places she had actually been, that had been classified when she left, sealed into a system she had no access to, and she had told herself over the years that she didn't need it, that it was enough to know what she had done even if no one else did. She had believed that. Mostly. "She came for me specifically?" Emma said. "You're in Holt's investigation," Reeves said. "The personnel action against you triggered a review of your original separation record. When Garza's office pulled it, she flagged it immediately." He paused. "She's been trying to find the right mechanism to return it for 2 years. The investigation gave her the mechanism." Emma looked at the window. The mountains. 2 years, she said. "The system is not fast," Reeves said, with a flatness that acknowledged both the absurdity and the reality of that fact without elaborating on either. She turned away from the window. "Let's go." Colonel Nadia Garza was standing when Emma came through the door of Suite 4. She was a compact woman in her mid-50s with close-cropped gray hair and the bearing of someone who had spent a career in medical command, not combat posture exactly, but the version of it that forms when you have spent 20 years making decisions about people's lives and have learned to carry the weight of that without letting it show in how you hold your shoulders. She was in uniform, the kind of uniform that communicated, without requiring any further explanation, that this visit was official. Holt was still in the bed. He looked worse than he had 90 minutes ago, which was the honest cost of the statement he'd given. The energy expenditure of a man running on surgical recovery and determination. But his eyes were still clear, and he gave Emma a nod when she came in that communicated something like acknowledgement or maybe respect without being explicit about either. Torres was gone, probably at the desk, giving them the room. Reeves came in behind Emma and closed the door. Garza looked at Emma with the direct assessment of someone who has read a file and is now comparing the file to the person. Not unfriendly. Not warm either. The specific professionalism of military medicine, which had always felt to Emma like a dialect she spoke but had stopped using. "Whitaker," Garza said. "Colonel." Garza reached to the chair beside her and picked up a sealed folder, standard military classification packaging, the kind Emma hadn't seen in 7 years but recognized immediately, the way you recognize the shape of something you once handled daily. She held it for a moment. "Operation Vantage Cross," she said. "Northern Quadrant 2017. Do you need me to detail what that was?" "No," Emma said. You were attached to a 12-person special operations element as the primary combat medic, Garza said. It wasn't a question. She was reading the record into the room, establishing it formally. Over a period of 11 days, you provided emergency medical care under fire in conditions that resulted in the survival of 7 personnel who would not otherwise have survived. She paused. The element commander's after-action report described your performance as, she looked at the folder, the most technically advanced battlefield medicine I have observed in 20 years of service, executed under conditions that would have incapacitated a less experienced provider. The room was very quiet. Emma looked at a point on the wall and held very still, because she had learned a long time ago that the way to receive something you had stopped expecting was to hold still and let it arrive. The commendation associated with that operation was classified at the source, Garza continued. The decision to classify it was made at a command level above my office. I am not here to revisit that decision or to characterize it. I am here because the investigation into the personnel actions taken against you at this institution has surfaced the original record, and because you are owed its return. She stepped forward and held out the folder. This is your record, Whitaker, complete and unredacted. Emma took it. It was lighter than it should have been, for something that had been sitting in a classified system for 7 years. Paper in a sealed folder. The same weight as anything else. She looked at it for a moment, and then she looked at Garza and said, "Why did they seal it?" Garza held her gaze. The operation it documented could not be acknowledged through normal channels at the time. Sealing the associated commendations was the administrative consequence of that. She paused. Whether that was the right decision is above my pay grade and outside the scope of why I'm here. But you came anyway, Emma said. 2 years of trying to find the mechanism. Garza's expression shifted, fractionally, and only for a moment, but Emma caught it. The specific look of someone who has done something they believe is correct and is not interested in being thanked for it, but is also not going to pretend it was effortless. You earned what's in that folder, Garza said. It should have your name on it. Emma held the folder and looked at it, and did not feel the thing she might have expected to feel. Not vindication exactly, not the dramatic emotional release of a closure long awaited. She felt something quieter and more complicated. The sensation of a weight she had carried for so long, it had stopped registering as weight finally becoming visible as a weight, and then becoming lighter. Not gone, not erased, just legible. She had done those things. She had always known she had done those things. The paper just made it so that the world could know it too. Thank you, she said to Garza. Simply, without elaboration, because the elaboration would have been for her own benefit and not for Garza's. And this wasn't the moment for that. Garza gave a short nod. There's one more thing. She reached into the breast pocket of her uniform and produced a smaller envelope, letter-sized, white, with a seal Emma recognized from a different context than hospitals. The Army Medical Command has been informed of the events of last night. The technique you used in the trauma bay has been noted in the report that Holt's team filed at 0600. She held out the envelope. This is a formal request, not an order. You separated honorably. You have no current obligation. A request. Emma looked at the envelope but didn't take it immediately. For what? The curriculum at Fort Bliss, Garza said. Sergeant Kwan's course. It was reinstated in 2022 with reduced funding and a gap in the senior instructor position that's been filled by rotating personnel ever since. She paused. The command believes the technique you applied last night should be in the curriculum as a standard module. They'd like the person who applied it to be involved in building that module. Another pause. You don't have to decide now. Emma took the envelope. She stood in Suite 4 of the recovery ward of Redwood Valley Medical Center with a classified record in one hand and a letter from the Army Medical Command in the other, and thought about the last 7 years. The deliberate smallness she'd chosen, the overnight shifts and the supply forms, and the careful accumulation of a life that didn't draw attention or demand anything complicated from her. And she thought about last night, about the 4 minutes of compression and the feeling of a man's life under her hands and the clarity of knowing exactly what to do and having the skill to do it. She had not felt that clarity, that specific, uncomplicated sense of being exactly the right person in exactly the right moment in a very long time. She had missed it. She was only now allowing herself to know how much. I'll read the letter, she said. Garza accepted this with the nod of someone who has learned not to push past a reasonable response when they've gotten one. She gathered her things, said something brief and professional to Holt, gave Reeves a look that communicated something in the shorthand of people who work adjacent to the same machinery, and left. Emma sat down in the chair beside Holt's bed. He was watching her with the tired, clear-eyed attention of a man who had been awake too long and was going to be in this bed for several more days and had made his peace with that. "The letter," he said. "Are you going to take it?" "I said I'd read it." "You know what you're going to do." She looked at him. "You don't know me well enough to say that." "I know what you did last night," he said. "That's enough." He shifted against the pillow. Another small cost. Absorbed without complaint. People who have that kind of skill and choose not to use it, they're not actually at peace with that choice. They're just waiting for the situation that makes the choice impossible. Emma said nothing. "Last night was your situation," he said. She held the folder and the envelope and looked at the window. Outside, the morning was full now, the mountains clear and bright, and the parking lot below beginning to show the normal movement of a hospital entering its day shift. Cars arriving. People who didn't know what had happened overnight coming to work in a building that was in the process of becoming a different institution than the one they'd left yesterday. "Get some rest," she said to Holt. "You had major surgery 12 hours ago, and you've been talking for 90 minutes. He almost smiled. "Yes, ma'am." She stood and left the suite and stood in the corridor for a moment with both documents in her hands, and then she put the envelope in her scrub pocket and walked toward the stairwell. The next 3 weeks were not clean or simple or the kind of resolution that resolves neatly into a moment you can point to and say, "There. That's where it ended." That was not how these things worked, and Emma had enough experience with institutions, military and civilian, to know better than to expect otherwise. What happened was more like a structure being taken apart piece by piece, each piece removed in the specific sequence required by its function in the whole. Langley was formally arrested at 8:47 on the morning following the night, in the third-floor corridor of Redwood Valley Medical Center, in front of the nursing staff who had been coming in for day shift and who witnessed it with the varied expressions of people who were surprised and people who were not surprised and people who had known something was wrong for a long time and had told themselves they were imagining it. He was walked out through the main entrance in handcuffs, which Emma did not witness. She was in the ER break room when it happened, finally eating an actual meal, but which was described to her afterward by 3 separate people in 3 slightly different versions that agreed on the essential detail. He did not say anything. He walked with the dignity of a man who understood that his remaining options were limited and had chosen to spend them on composure. Fitch was not arrested that morning. The investigation required another 11 days to build the case to the standard that Ortega's office required before making the arrest, which was frustrating in the abstract and necessary in the specific. He was arrested at his home in Denver on a Tuesday afternoon quietly, without the visible drama of Langley's departure from the hospital. Emma learned about it from a text message from Reeves that said only, "Fitch, this afternoon, it's done." She stood in the medication room on the second floor where she had been working, read the message, put her phone back in her pocket, and returned to what she was doing. The formal withdrawal of the preliminary complaint to the Colorado State Board of Nursing was processed within 72 hours of the investigation going on record. Emma received a letter, physical mail, the board apparently retained a preference for paper, that was written in the specific bureaucratic language of institutions correcting themselves, which managed to communicate that the complaint had been withdrawn without quite communicating the circumstances that had made it necessary. She read it once and put it in a folder. The board sent a second letter 2 weeks later. This one was different in tone, drafted, she suspected, by someone who had been briefed on the full context and understood that the first letter's language was inadequate. The second letter acknowledged that the preliminary notice had been filed in bad faith, that it had been identified as part of a documented pattern of obstruction, and that her professional record with the board was clear and would remain clear. It was signed by the board's director and included a direct apology that used the word apology rather than a legal circumlocution. She read that one twice. The hospital board, the remaining members, the ones who had not been arrested, and who were now engaged in the very unpleasant work of understanding what the institution they were supposed to be governing had actually been doing, held an emergency session in the second week. They brought in an interim director. They commissioned an independent review. They did the institutional things that institutions do when they are trying to demonstrate seriousness while also protecting themselves from the full cost of what their predecessors did, which was a balance Emma understood and found neither satisfying nor surprising. What they also did, in the third week, was issue a public statement. Emma found out about the statement from Della, who appeared in the doorway of the break room on a Wednesday morning with her phone extended and an expression that was caught between something complicated and something that was simply pleased. The statement was 3 paragraphs. The first paragraph described the investigation and its findings in general terms. The second paragraph acknowledged that multiple staff members had been subjected to retaliatory professional actions as a result of their competence or their questioning of administrative decisions, and committed to the remediation of those actions. The third paragraph named Emma specifically. It stated that she had been the subject of a bad faith preliminary complaint, that the complaint had been filed in response to her identification of billing irregularities, and that her clinical judgment, including her actions in the trauma bay on the night of the investigation, had been not only appropriate, but had directly saved the life of a patient who would not otherwise have survived. It used the word hero once. Emma noted this and found it, as she generally found that word, both meaningful and slightly too simple for what the actual thing had been. But she understood why they'd used it, and she didn't argue with it. The statement was published on the hospital's website and picked up by the local paper in Ashford, which ran a story that was more detailed than Emma would have preferred. 2 larger Colorado outlets ran shorter versions. She got phone calls she didn't answer, and emails she answered briefly, and a message from her mother in Cincinnati that said, in its entirety, "I saw the article I always knew. Call me when you can. Love." She called her mother that evening, and they talked for 45 minutes, which was longer than they usually talked. And she didn't tell her mother everything, but she told her more than she had in a long time, and her mother listened without interrupting except once, near the end, when she said, "You sound like yourself." Emma had not known what to say to that, so she said, "Yeah," and her mother seemed to understand that as sufficient. Harmon had given his statement about the 3 reports Langley had asked him to revise. He had done it, as Emma had advised, without minimizing and without elaborating, just the facts in their sequence, including what Langley had said and what he himself had done. The investigators had thanked him for his thoroughness. He had come to Emma afterward in the hallway near the medication station and stood there for a moment with the particular expression of someone who has done something they should have done sooner and is deciding whether to say so out loud. "I should have said something earlier," he said. "The reports." "Yes," Emma said. She didn't add anything to it. No absolution, no comfort that would let him off the hook without his having earned it. He was a good doctor in formation, and she respected him enough to let the statement stand. He nodded. "I'll do better." "Good," she said, and went back to work. On the 19th day, Emma went back to the Army Medical Command letter. She had read it 3 times since Garza had handed it to her. Each time she had put it back in the envelope, and the envelope back in the folder with the classified record, and thought about it separately from the reading, which was a habit she'd developed in situations where the thinking was more important than the immediate response. The letter was formal in its language, but specific in its request. Not vague. Not the kind of institutional outreach that was designed to flatter without actually meaning anything. They had identified a gap in the curriculum. They had identified the specific technique. They had identified, from Holt's report and from whatever else was in her classified file, that she was the right person to address it. The position was part-time, initially. A consulting contract, not a reactivation. She would not be returning to service. She would be returning to a room at Fort Bliss with a whiteboard and a group of combat medics who needed to know something that she knew, and she would teach it the way Sergeant Kwan had taught her, methodically, without ceremony, with the understanding that the person in front of you might someday need this exact information in conditions where there is no time to look anything up. She called the number on the letter on a Thursday afternoon from her apartment. The conversation was shorter than she expected. They had been waiting for her call. The contract terms were what the letter had described. She asked 2 questions and received 2 answers and said she would confirm in writing by the end of the week, and that was that. She sat in her apartment after the call and looked at the mountains through the window, She had chosen this apartment partly for that view, the mountains that you could see from the east-facing window on clear days, which was most days, and she thought about the question of who she was, not in an abstract way, in the specific way of someone taking inventory. She was 29 years old. She was a nurse at Redwood Valley Medical Center, which was in the process of becoming a different institution under interim leadership, and where the staff who had spent years arranging themselves around Langley's moods were slowly, tentatively learning to take up space they'd been keeping small. She was the subject of a public statement that used the word hero. She was the holder of a classified record that had been returned to her after 7 years in a system she couldn't access. She was the author of a technique that had kept a man alive on an ER table while she was being told to back off. She was also the person who had spent 11 months in a break room eating Della's hidden granola bars and trying, with genuine effort, to want nothing more than the quiet accumulation of ordinary days. Both things were true. She had not resolved the tension between them so much as she had accepted that it was the tension she lived in, and that this was not a failure, but a description. The commendation ceremony was held on a Friday morning, 23 days after the night that had started it. It was not large or elaborate, a conference room on the second floor of Redwood Valley Medical Center that had been arranged with chairs and a small presentation area, the kind of space that served double duty as a meeting room and whatever else the institution needed it to be. Reeves had come back from wherever he'd been in the intervening weeks. Holt was there in a wheelchair, still recovering, dressed in civilian clothes and looking considerably more human than he had in the hospital bed, but still carrying the careful movement of someone whose left side was reminding him of what had happened. Garza was there in uniform. The hospital staff who attended were the ones who had been there that night: Della, Torres, Harmon, Martinez, Park, Soto, and some who hadn't been but had followed the investigation through its 3 weeks of institutional unraveling. The interim director was there, a woman named Dr. Simone Rafferty, who had taken the position with the specific energy of someone who understood that the job was partly administrative and partly archaeological. She shook Emma's hand before the ceremony began and said, "I've read your record, both of them." She said it simply, without elaboration, which was the correct amount. The ceremony itself was straightforward. Reeves spoke briefly. Garza presented the formal military commendation, the one from Operation Vantage Cross, now declassified under the mechanism that Holt's investigation had provided, which meant it could be named and read into the room publicly for the first time. She read the element commander's assessment aloud, in the same words she had read to Emma in Suite 4, and the room was quiet in a way that had weight to it. Emma received it without speech, because she had not been asked to give one and would have found it difficult to do so. She held the commendation and looked at it and thought about a training room in Texas and a commanding officer she hadn't spoken to in 7 years and a set of skills she had spent 7 years pretending she had put away. Then Holt spoke. He spoke from the wheelchair, which he acknowledged with the dry pragmatism of a man who was not going to pretend his situation was other than it was. He spoke about the investigation, not in classified detail but in the general shape of it, the 4 years of fraud and the personnel actions and the mechanism by which one flagged discrepancy on a supply form had set in motion the sequence of events that ended in this room. He named what Langley had done: the preliminary complaint, the strategic intimidation, the years of manufactured concerns about professional conduct, in plain language, without euphemism, in front of the staff who had worked under Langley and who needed to hear it named. "The system failed the people in this room," Holt said. He was not a man given to eloquence, and the plainness of it was what gave it weight. It failed them specifically and deliberately, through actions that were designed to protect an arrangement that should never have existed. That failure has consequences now. But I want to be clear about something. He paused and looked at Emma. The system's failure was not the last word. It wasn't the last word because the people it was designed to silence didn't stop being good at their jobs. They couldn't. That's the thing about actual competence. You can suppress the record of it, but you cannot suppress the thing itself. It keeps showing up, last night, in an ER, saving someone's life while being told to back off. Emma looked at the floor for a moment. Then she looked up. When Reeves shook her hand afterward, he held it a beat longer than protocol required and said, quietly, "You never stopped being a soldier." She had known from the moment she woke up that morning that someone was going to say something like that. She had been thinking about how to respond to it, not defensively, not dismissively, but accurately. "I know," she said. "I just found a different uniform." He smiled. Actually smiled. The first time she had seen him do it without the careful reservation that had characterized every interaction of the last 23 days. It changed his face considerably. The room was beginning to move around them, the specific dispersal of a ceremony ending, people returning to the ordinary current of their day. Della appeared at Emma's elbow and gave her a look that communicated, in the shorthand of women who have worked the same building through the same crisis, that there were things to say that didn't need to be said right now. Emma understood this and appreciated it. Holt caught her eye from the wheelchair. He raised his chin slightly. A question. She gave a small nod. Yes, she'd made the call. Yes, she was taking the contract. Yes, the curriculum was going to have the module it should have had 10 years ago. He gave a nod back, and that was sufficient. She left the conference room and walked the hospital corridor, the second floor, the recovery wing, past the door of Suite 4 where the bed had been remade and the room turned over and the occupant long since transferred to a secure facility. And she thought about something Holt had said in his remarks. You cannot suppress the thing itself. It keeps showing up. She had spent 7 years trying to suppress it. The training, the instincts, the specific combination of skill and judgment that had formed in her between the ages of 19 and 22 in conditions she had spent years trying not to think about. She had put it away because she had needed to, because carrying it fully and openly was not something she knew how to do when she was no longer in the context that made sense of it. She had not been wrong to put it down. The putting down had been necessary, and she did not regret the 7 years of ordinary days because ordinary days had given her things the Army never had. The supply form in March, the observation about the dock cameras, the knowledge of Della's granola bars and Harmon's exhaustion, and the specific way the hospital's building breathed at 2 in the morning. All of it had been preparation she hadn't known she was doing for a night she hadn't known was coming. That was how it worked. You didn't always know what you were building when you were building it. You just kept doing the work with integrity, and you kept noticing the things that were worth noticing, and you kept showing up. And sometimes, not always, not even often, the moment arrived that made the whole accumulation make sense. She pushed through the stairwell door and walked down to the first floor and came out into the ER. Day shift was running. The bay was in motion, not crisis motion, the steady productive motion of a medical unit doing its work. Torres was off. Della was somewhere in the back. Harmon was at the desk with a chart. The desk clerk looked up when Emma came through and gave her the nod of someone who has revised their understanding of a person and is still adjusting to the revision. Emma pulled on a pair of gloves. She had a shift in 40 minutes. She was going to work it. Not because she had to. The interim director had offered her time off and she had declined. Not to prove something. She was done with having to prove things. Or at least she was done with the version of that where the proof was for someone else's benefit. She was going to work the shift because this was her floor, and these were her patients, and the work was what she was good at, and being good at something and doing it with your full attention and your full skill was not something you performed for an audience. It was something you did because it was the thing you were meant to do. Harmon looked up from his chart, looked at her, looked at the gloves. Bay 2 is holding a patient, he said. Chest pain, probable cardiac, needs an assessment. I've got it, she said. She walked into the bay. The patient was a man in his 60s who was frightened in the specific way of people who have never been seriously ill and are now confronting the possibility that their body has been running a process without their knowledge. Emma introduced herself, took his hand to check his pulse, and asked him to tell her what had started, and when, and what it felt like. He talked. She listened. She noted the things worth noting with the attention of someone who had spent 23 days being reminded that the things worth noting were worth noting for real, actual reasons that had real, actual consequences, and that the people who did the noticing were not a problem to be managed, but a system designed to be right. She had been told to back off for 11 months. She had never actually backed off. There was a lesson in that, not a complicated one, not the kind that needed to be explained at length, or decorated with language that made it sound larger than it was. Just this. When you know what you're doing, and you know why you're doing it, and you know that it matters, you keep doing it. You document what you see. You say what you see. You hold the compression for 4 minutes when someone tells you to step away. Because the person on the table needs the 4 minutes more than you need the approval of the person doing the telling. You stay. Not because staying is easy or because it doesn't cost anything. It costs, always, more than the people watching from the outside understand. But because the alternative is not a life that fits you. Because the quietness you were trying to build was never actually quiet. It was just a version of yourself with the volume turned down. And the volume had been waiting for 7 years. For someone to need it turned back up. Emma finished the assessment. She documented it correctly, completely, in the language that would matter when someone else needed to read it. She flagged the finding that was worth flagging and recommended the follow-up that the finding warranted. She walked out of Bay 2 and into the corridor and looked at the ER, the ordinary, ongoing, imperfect machinery of a place where people came when something was wrong and needed someone who knew what to do about it. And she thought, this is where I am. This is what I do. It wasn't the answer to every question. It wasn't the end of every complication. The contract with Fort Bliss would bring its own set of difficulties, and the hospital's recovery from its own corruption would be slow and uneven, and there were things in her classified record that she would carry regardless of whether anyone else could read them. But she was here. She was working. She was the person who knew what to do when the monitor screamed and the clock ran out and everyone in the room was looking at someone else. She had always been that person. Now, finally, the room knew it too.